So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Niuversity, to one of our live webinars. We are very happy to have you here, and I'm very, very happy and honored to have my guest, Dr. Nigel Huckstep. And if you're following me on social media, maybe you've read, I shared a little story that I would like to repeat here at the beginning, and I titled it The Power of Digital Identity. I mean, I don't know Nigel at all. I met him, I think, a month and a half ago here in my office in Berlin. But how we got together. There was one of the professors who taught me at Edinburgh University when I was doing my master's degree in TESOL back in 2002 and 2003, Dr. Arthur McNeill. And I think the last time, or not, I'm sure the last day I met him was my graduation day, which was the 3rd of December, 2003, and I haven't met him afterwards. I think in 2014, I created my Facebook account, and we got to meet again online in the Facebook realm. And then he started commenting on my posts, and then we connected also on LinkedIn. And when I established Niuversity, he was always following. He showed a lot of admiring of the work we are doing there, and we had a couple of conversations. And Dr. Huckstep was working with him in Hong Kong, and he retired. I mean, he will introduce himself fully now. I'm just telling you the story how we met. So he retired in Hong Kong and decided to leave the country and go back. But since he comes, I mean, his mother is German and he speaks German. I mean, I think I don't know if you are bilingual or multilingual, but he speaks German like natives. So he decided to come to Berlin and live in Berlin. And he contacted me by email and saying that he is the colleague of Arthur McNeill, and he also likes what we are doing at Niuversity and whether we can cooperate. And then we met. And this is the first fruit of our meeting. And hopefully a long-term relation. And I think also by the end of today's workshop, we will announce another fruit that's coming soon. So Dr. Huckstep, I'm very, very happy to have you here, and thank you very much for your time. And I'm looking forward with my colleagues and friends and the audience to this interesting and hopefully very informative workshop about teaching languages online, because this is a big issue, especially after the pandemic. So once again, welcome to Niuversity, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the generous welcome, Fadi, and hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. Once again, thank you to Fadi for inviting me to talk. I'm going to start with a warning that I haven't actually used this particular version of Zoom before, the Zoom webinar, but Fadi has given me a very good, very speedy tutorial, and actually it's not very different from the version of Zoom that I've used a great deal. So I'm going to start by sharing a screen with you, which is a PowerPoint, which is going to lead us through the workshop this afternoon. So I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit about me, although Fadi has told you a certain amount already. I have retired, so all of these academic qualifications were got a very long time ago, but you'll see that they are basically qualifications founded in language and things to do with language. And in my working life, which I don't consider yet to be completely over, which is why I'm very happy to be able to collaborate with Fadi and Niuversity. Teaching has been a predominant activity, but I have also done quite a lot of research. So language teaching and research about things that are to do with language are certainly things that have characterized my working life. This afternoon, we're going to, or this evening, we're going to talk mostly based on my experience. I'm going to talk with you about online language teaching. So I'm just going to give you a very brief account of how I became involved in online language teaching rather than language teaching in general. The last place I worked in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, where Fadi and my mutual friend Arthur McNeill was director of the Centre for Language Education, is, as it says in the title, a science and technology university. So they were early adopters, or at least I can say early considerers about the possibilities of technology-enhanced teaching and learning. And very soon after I went to work there, I became involved in these initiatives and developed a very large, by Hong Kong standards. So what does that mean? It means every term 1,200 students. I know in some parts of the world that's not a large class, but in Hong Kong it is. I developed a large undergraduate writing course with 1,200 students as the target audience in a blended learning environment. So it was a mixture of face-to-face teaching and online teaching. And then from 2016, I was in my last formal post in the university as an associate director of the Centre for Language Education. And one of my responsibilities there was online teaching and learning, because as I say, it was a clear focus of the university as a whole, not just in the area of language teaching, but in the wider area of university level education. And because of this involvement and these two interests that I've just mentioned and responsibilities, for the last 7 or so years of my working life, I was involved in various initiatives in teacher education at the level of my university and beyond. And so that was all going on and everything was normal. And then in 2019, as you will know, Hong Kong was rocked by pro-democracy protests, of which I was an active supporter and am. And as a result of those protests and what was happening at that time, our university was proactively closed by our president. And that happened at the end of a Friday morning when we were having a graduation ceremony. And we were told over the course of the weekend, I'm afraid my memory as to when isn't terribly clear, that the university was going to close for a week and it would then reopen as a completely online institution. This is a university, for some context, I should just tell you, again, by Hong Kong standards, it's not particularly big. By, I think, some other standards, it's very small. It had probably only about 6,000 or 7,000 undergraduates and about another 3,000 or 4,000 postgraduates. It's a science and technology university, so not a comprehensive university as such. It had schools of science, it has schools of science, engineering, business studies, and for quite bizarre historical reasons, also a School of Social Sciences and Humanities. So that's the kind of size that we had to move online within a week. Now, it helped that the university had been an early considerer of online teaching and learning. So that happened, and we finished up that term because the term system was one term up until the Christmas and Solar New Year, and then another term after that, so a 2-term system. And then COVID arrived from very nearby, just over the border in Wuhan in China. And it was decided very, very quickly in Hong Kong that universities would not open with face-to-face tuition in the February of 2020, which is when our second term would have started. And so again, very, very quickly, we postponed the start of the term by, I think, a week or possibly 2 weeks, and we put the whole of the university online. Now, obviously, that is not an ideal way to make this move, but it had, I think, some benefits. It also had some disadvantages, but the benefits were that we had to think quite seriously and quite quickly about online teaching and learning. And it also had the benefit that colleagues who perhaps were less enthusiastic about online teaching and learning were simply presented with a fait accompli. They were told, okay, you have to teach online. So the problems that some of you in university departments may be familiar with of bringing everyone with you if you're starting something new, those problems were not as great as they might otherwise have been. And in the period after I left Hong Kong, which was about 6 months after I formally retired, I went on teaching for the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology and also for one other university. And then we moved to Berlin, and I carried on doing a little bit of work while I was here, including in the first term of 2021, at very, very short notice, setting up an MA level research methods and research course for one of the international programs, which was also being delivered online. So although this is perhaps not the best way of moving a university entirely online, it happened, it involved a lot of people, and I was lucky in that my university had an extremely supportive president. It was a university which was extremely well resourced, and it was a university that had already done a lot of thinking about online teaching and learning. The other university, it was interesting to me to compare the other university, which I'm not going to name, where I was asked to help out in the last months before we left Hong Kong, which is a comprehensive university, all the normal faculties you would normally expect, except no medicine. It wasn't a university that had thought a lot about or prepared a lot about online teaching and learning. And the experience of what we were able to offer at Hong Kong UST, University of Science and Technology, which was far from perfect, but it was, I think, at least okay. And what was being offered at this other institution, that was also really, I have to say, quite instructive. So the first thing I need to say is I'm not going to talk all the time this afternoon. There are going to be periods when I'm going to ask you to think or talk or perhaps think about contributing. And I'd like to start off with a poll which Fadi has prepared for us and which he will take over and administer. I just basically would like to know how many of you have already taught languages online. And you've already answered that for me. That's brilliant. Okay. Some people have, okay, some answers are still coming in.
Yeah, we need to give them maybe 30 to 40 seconds.
Okay, thanks, Adi. I'll give you some time to answer. Please, I'm asking specifically about languages because as you'll see as we go on through the rest of the afternoon, I do think it's different. So I'll just be quiet for a few seconds and have a glass of water while you finish answering that poll. Okay, I'll just wait a little longer to see if anyone.
So it seems
Okay.
that a little bit more than half of the audience did not have any experience with this or have not taught languages online, and a little bit less than half have already done that.
Okay, that's helpful to me. I will try and incorporate that information into the way that I lead us through the rest of the workshop, because it's obviously it's important. So thanks very much indeed, everybody, for sharing that information. Okay, so just about half of you have got some experience and just about half haven't, of those who've answered. Okay. Let me just go on. A few housekeeping notes in addition to Fadi's from me, if I can just make it clear. As Fadi said, you're going to get a link to this recording, so that's helpful. But just so that you know that not everything I say is on my PowerPoint, you should be relieved that not everything I say is on my PowerPoint slides. You might or might not want to make notes. The purpose of these slides is just to guide us through the workshop. There will be regular pauses so that you can ask questions. And on the whole, unless the question is absolutely vitally urgent, I'd be grateful if you could probably keep the questions which you submit, as Fadi said, through the Q&A function for these pauses, because I think that will probably help us to run the workshop more smoothly. And here is an outline. I think given you enough background about me. And like Fadi, I'm very happy for you to call me Nigel. There's no need to bother with titles or stuff like that. This is an outline of what we're going to do. I'm going to start off with a brief consideration of theory and practice, very brief, just so that you know where I stand on that issue. And then we're going to look at the issue of student engagement. As when Fadi and I had our conversation about a month and a half ago about what people might like to think about with regard to online language teaching and learning, we thought about three things. And they were things that Fadi actually articulated, but they match things that colleagues in Hong Kong and East Asia, where I also was part of a network of language teachers looking at online issues. These are concerns that it seems to me that most people share, okay? How do we get students actually to engage in an online context? And I'm going to look at that through a consideration of student motivation. And then after we've done that, there'll be some time for a reflection or mini Q&A. And the second thing that Fadi and I both think people would like to think about in terms of online teaching and learning is, okay, once we've got students' interest, how do we actually get them to do stuff? Rather than, you know, any of you who've taught using Zoom Classroom, particularly with very big classes, how do we make sure that students do things, which of course is essential to language teaching and learning, rather than just sitting in front of a screen with another device looking at something else, or, you know, whatever. You know what I mean if you've already taught large classes online. And I'm going to look at that through a focus on instructional approaches, and I will explain what all of these focuses are as we go through. And then there'll be some more time for reflection and question and answers. And then lastly, Fadi and I thought what people would like to think about is, okay, we've got students' attention, they're engaged. We've worked out how to actually make sure that they do things in our online language teaching and learning. How do we make sure it actually works? How do we make sure that at the end of whatever the course is, our students really can do what we have said they will be able to do as part of our course intended learning outcomes? And I'm going to look at that through a very old-fashioned focus, but one that I continue to think is important, which is pedagogy. And then at the end of the session, I will offer some concluding remarks, and then there will be time for a final question and answer session at the end of my workshop. But there will, wherever there's red on the screen there in front of you now, there's going to be a pause when you will have time to ask questions, and perhaps we can have a mini Q&A. Fadi has very kindly agreed to moderate that part of this afternoon's workshop for me, and for us, sorry, I should say. So theory and practice, very, very briefly, it's an old opposition, not just in teaching. Certainly in European countries, people who do courses in teacher education will often say to you, oh yes, I read Piaget, for example, when I was at university. I've never thought about it since. It's something you hear a lot, particularly in educational institutions. It's a dichotomy, perhaps. So I think basically there are three ways in which the theory and practice opposition can be resolved. Either you think, like the people who say, oh yeah, I read Piaget when I was studying and it was very important and it gave me these insights, but now I'm actually doing it. What I'm calling here a double bind, where like the person precariously balanced here, it's not really easy to benefit from the firmness of the ground or the sensation of falling, however you want to think of that positively, that it's difficult to get the benefits of both theory and practice. There's another view illustrated by this rather silly cartoon, which says that they're just in opposition. Theory is fine and that's there, and you do that because you have to or you want to at a certain stage, and then you actually go and do the job. And then there's what I think, which is actually the two, the opposition isn't an opposition at all, but the two ideas need to be, if we're going to be effective educators, they need to be intertwined. And that's the perspective from which I'm going to talk about the rest of the content of this afternoon's workshop. And now, I'm going to hand over to Fadi again, who's got another activity for you. I'm going to ask you about your experience of online teaching. And in a minute, Fadi is going to send you a link which you can use to input words which answer these questions. Now, I'm glad that I put these the top 2 points in, because there are about half of the colleagues with us today who haven't taught languages online. So if you have taught languages online, first of all, what problems or what challenges have you encountered? If you haven't, what problems or challenges do you think you might encounter? And Fadi is going to use an application to help us make a word cloud of your responses. So I'll stop now and hand over to Fadi, who will take over that part.
Yes, the link is already in your chat box, or you can just go to, as you can see on the screen, you can see my screen now, I think. It's www.menti.com and use this code 248-69586. Or you just click the link in the chat and it will take you immediately to this page and where you can put your answers. First answer comes. Thank you. And each one of you can also put multiple answers, not only one word.
And we'll give you 2 or 3 minutes, I think, to think about that, because it's maybe you weren't expecting us to put you on the spot quite so early. So we'll give you 2 or 3 minutes to think about what you'd like to put in the word cloud.
If you have any problem accessing the website, please let me know in the chat. But it's just, if you click at the link I sent you to the in the chat box, you can get an immediate access to the website. And you can do this by your mobile if you like, especially Lida and her friends. Each one can do it through her or his mobile.
To mine. So thank you for sharing your experience of online teaching. So I'm going to try and hold all of that in my post-retirement brain and modify how I guide us through the next three things we're going to talk about, which are student engagement. How do we get students involved? Useful interactions. How do we make sure students do more than just be there? They actually engage with the learning process. And how do we make sure that the whole thing is effective? In other words, as far as I'm concerned, how do we develop a pedagogy? Because a pedagogy, to be a pedagogy, has to be effective. And I'm going to try and keep all of your experiences, your concerns, and the fact that half of you have taught online and half of you have yet to do it. I'm going to try and keep all of that in the back of my mind while I go. But please do use the Q&A function to stack up some questions, because there are going to be, as you'll remember, some frequent chances for us to do mini Q&As later. So I'm going to consider these three things talking to you: getting students engaged, getting students to interact, and developing a pedagogy, which means we deliver a course that works. I'm going to consider them. And I'm going to give examples, because I think that's one way in which theory and practice come together. You say, well, in theory, we can do this, and in practice, this is what it might look like. And so the practice part of the theory and practice opposition is accessible to everybody who's joined us this afternoon. I'm going to use the context of teaching a language to the Common European Framework of Languages, level A1 and A2. If you don't know CEFR, apologies if you do, but it's important that everybody knows. The Common European Framework is a framework that was worked on and has been adopted by the European Union. It's very widely used outside the European Union, and it basically offers a description of language proficiency, counterintuitively to me, starting at A1, which is the lowest, and going to C2, which is the highest level of proficiency, which describes somebody who is a very, very competent, independent user of the language. Now, it's only got, therefore, 6 levels. A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2, 6 levels altogether. It's obviously very, very general, but it's something that you can go off and look up online. So that's just so that you know that this is what the level at which I'm going to be offering my examples. And I'm going to use the language of English because the CEFR, the Common European Framework, can apply in principle to any language. I'm going to use the example of English because that's one of our common languages, at least today. So language, that's what we all have in common in many ways as a species, and also it's what we teach. I'm going to ask for you to do something in private now, which is, and it's a very demanding thing to do without notice, but so I'm going to give you about a minute to think about it. If you had to define language in one sentence, what would you say? You don't need to share it with us. You might want to later in the Q&A, but for now, I'd like you just to think about it for yourselves for about a minute, please. If you had to define language in one sentence, how would you define it? Language, I mean, as the phenomenon, not a language. I mean, the fact that we have language and the birds sitting outside my flat here don't. They may communicate, but they don't have language. Okay, how would you define language in one sentence? I'll just give you about a minute to think about that. In about 30 seconds. Okay, if you have found that a really difficult task, you're right, it is. And if you haven't finished your sentence, don't worry, you can think about it again later. It's just something that I would say, it's complicated. It's very, very complicated. One idea, and an idea I find useful, is to think of language as a construct that consists of form and function. And in fact, I'm sure that you all know, they are two bases of, or two basic approaches to linguistics, formalistics and functionalist linguistics. People at various stages and at various points identify themselves as one or other. Excuse me, I find it's more useful to consider both ways of looking at language. When we think about form in language, we're thinking about structure. So we think about what's regular, what's not regular. So in the sense of English, third person present tense verbs regularly have an S marker. She plays, she works, she drives. Constraints, what can you and can you not do in a language? How important is pronunciation? In English, pronunciation has some importance, but it's a very forgiving language. You can pronounce in lots of different ways. You're still likely to be understood. In the language we speak at home in Hong Kong, Cantonese, pronunciation is very highly constrained because Cantonese is a tonal language. And if you get a tone wrong, you may not be understood. It's about issues of grammar, about issues of accuracy. So that's form. Function. How do we use a language? How do we create meaning in a language? How do we communicate? I noticed that some of the things that you put in the word crowd were very sensitive to this kind of issue. Because of course, the thing is that when we teach language, we're also using language. When you teach physics, you're not using physics to teach it as a means of communication. Of course, a good teacher will use examples of physics and so on and so forth. But in language, you're using the thing we teach. Talk about language all the time at the same time as we're teaching it. And that's a function of language. It's why we can do it. The sort of superficial characteristics of a language to do with function would be things like proficiency and fluency. And I think, as I've said, I'm not a great person for categorization, these bases for thinking about a language overlap. So what we're going to teach, or what we teach, is very, very complicated. Let's start at looking at concrete ways about how we can bring the study of this very, very complicated construct language into an online environment and teach it effectively. You cannot teach it effectively if you don't have the students with you. And I also notice from your thoughtful comments in the word cloud, a lot of those comments were related to students as well as to the teachers. So obviously we're limited for time this afternoon. There are lots and lots of things that we could say, or lots and lots of ways that we could look at student engagement. But for this afternoon, I'm just going to look at the one issue of motivation. And at the end of this bit on motivation, I'm going to stop, and there'll be time for some mini Q&A for really anything you want to talk about that's happened in the workshop so far, including what I'm now going to present about motivation. Okay, so motivation is, I think, part of the affective domain. In other words, the emotional, the social, the cultural aspects of education, and the idea that this was a valid part of education goes back, as you know, to Bloom's taxonomy. It hasn't always been a part of education. In some cultural contexts, it's still not a part of what is thought of as education. But from my perspective as a language educator, personally and professionally, the affective domain in language education is very important, and motivation is part of that focus. In the literature, you can trace ideas that motivation matters and that we can actually deal with it other than by just beating the students, which of course in Europe was, as in some other, other cultures, was formerly considered a perfectly valid way of educating people. Inflict discomfort and the subject will learn. Fortunately, we've moved on from that. And you can go back to John Schumann's work, I think, as a sort of really as a departure point in the 1970s, when he started to look at second language acquisition through socio-psychological research. Of course, things change, we learn more. As I always used to say to my students in Hong Kong, I am of a certain age. When I was your age, the field of second language acquisition as an academic endeavor hardly existed, and we knew almost nothing about it. 50 years, 60 years later, that situation has changed. And so it is that ideas about motivation, since Schumann first started to consider them, have moved on. And in general now, much of the work in the field considers motivation to be a kind of a process model. So motivation is part of a process. And to put it really, really simply, you have a reason to learn English. So it could be any language, but as I said, we're using English today as it's common for us. So you have a reason to learn English. You decide that you're going to learn English because you want to operationalize that reason. And you start to learn English and you persevere in your efforts. Now, when that happens successfully, motivation is happening. As I said, today is very much an introduction and a starter session, but so it's not very heavy on references and particular scholarly works or contributions. It's much more general, but a name that some of you may know connected with motivation is Zoltán Dönnyei, a scholar of Hungarian origin who moved to the UK, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year, but he has written very, very extensively on motivation. And his definition of motivation is on the screen there, and you can read it just as well as I can. So I'll let you read the definition while I have a glass of water. So, well, yes, perhaps I can hear you saying, of course it is. But the problem is that if motivation isn't there, the things that go on in the rest of the sentence, sustaining the activity and working at a certain level to pursue the activity, aren't there. And as some of your comments in the word cloud suggested, this can be a particular concern for people who are teaching languages online. So I think that we do need to think about it. Donier has a model for motivation in access, in action, sorry. It's a process model. The reference is at the bottom of the screen. Remember, you're going to get a link to this recording, so you'll have all of this to refer to later if you want to go deeper into the literature. Basically, Donier thinks that people have a pre-actional stage, which is where they make a choice about motivation. I think I need to learn English. Yeah. Am I going to do it? How do I go about doing it? Okay, I'm going to sign up for that online course. That's an executive stage where people actually do something about the motivation. And then the post-actional stage is when you think about what you're doing, about the learning that you're undertaking. This may seem like common sense, and if it is, then that's fine with me. But I think if you don't have at least a consideration that your students are going through a thought process or not about joining in your teaching and learning of a language, then that's part of the pedagogy that's missing. So I think we need definitely to consider motivation. And at the same time as Donier has this idea of a sort of progressive process model of motivation, he thinks that the people who are being motivated have different motivational selves. And he describes these as the ideal L2 self. So my ideal L2 self is, you know, I want to be able to speak English as well as my teacher. Okay, so that's what I want to do. I want to be able to speak English as well as my teacher can speak it. And I can actually see myself doing that. You know, I'm not sure how I'm going to get there. We're talking about ideal in the Platonic sense here, but you know, that's what I want to get to. And one day I'm going to sound like her, and I'm going to speak English just like that. Then there is the ought to self. Because certainly this is where I have to do a truth in lending moment and tell you that I am the laziest language learner in the world. You know, when I decided that I was going to try and learn to write modern standard written Chinese, I went and bought myself little exercise books divided into squares, and I practiced my characters. And you know, it's a very, I don't know if any of you are Chinese language users, but writing is quite an art, you know, and you need to get it right. And I'm quite lazy, so I basically just gave up. And fortunately, giving up coincided with the arrival of the smartphone, which has applications in it who correct your stroke order, which correct your stroke order for you. But I still know that I'm actually basically functionally illiterate in Chinese, because the things I can read are quite simple, and my ability to write is constrained by the fact that I'm just not going to sit down at the age I am now and learn the stroke order of 2,000 basic characters. So that's my ought to learning self. Now, we don't want an ought to learning self like me. We want an ought to learning self that's more positive and that might actually come to pass. But I mean, I hope that was a useful example. And then the third self, or the third aspect of the learning self that Donier sees is the self that considers the overall learning experience. And those three stages: I think I want to do this, I'm going to do it, how am I doing? The process model of motivation, coupled with the three ways of people thinking about themselves, are concepts that underpin Donier's work. So what we get from Donier, and what I think is important for what we're talking about this afternoon, which is online teaching of languages and how we bring our students with us. Motivation matters, and it's a quality we can examine and we can use. It's not static. It's not just one thing. It changes in its intensity and it changes in its focus. It's something that we can understand. And so what he says, that's the theory, this is the practice. This is what Donier and his collaborators suggest we as language educators do to manage and use motivation. We help students create and strengthen their ideal L2 self as is necessary in the teaching and learning process. And we teach in a way that supports this ideal self. And I'm going to give you some examples of how you could do that in a minute. Next, that you can incorporate students' visions of their L2 selves into your teaching plan. So not just the ideal self, but also your student thinking about, well, I ought maybe to do that, and I haven't, or one day I'm going to need to do that. And the student's self that thinks about his or her overall experience of learning. And also Donier, and this has been controversial, says that you need to maintain students' awareness of their ought to self. So in other words, somebody should be repeatedly saying to me, Nigel, if you had sat down a bit longer 20 years ago with your Chinese characters, now you might be able to read Hong Lao Mong. I mean, that's obviously quite an aggressive and not a very supportive way, and that's one of the reasons that this last point is controversial. So it's important to say about Donier, as with all scholars probably, anyway, these ideas have got their supporters and they've got their detractors, sorry, but there are serious, respectable studies that support the effectiveness of thinking about motivation in language teaching and learning. So that's the theory. We've moved there a little bit towards practice by me suggesting things you can do. Here's a concrete example of what a bit of a curriculum that's influenced by Donier might look like. And remember, you're going to get a link to a recording, so you'll have this for your reference if you pay me the honor of wanting to look at it again. So as part of the Common European Framework A1, which, remember, for me this is counterintuitive. A is the beginner level of CEFR. One of the things that students who are at that level are said to be able to do is to introduce themselves and ask questions about other people. So at a very simple level, what you might teach as part of your A1 curriculum would be how to introduce a person. You do teach that, I think, this old 3 Ps model you may be aware of. It's quite old now, but I still think it works. Present what you want to teach, okay? The introduction of a person. So, you know, hi, my name's Nigel, I live in Berlin, or whatever. Produce, get the students to repeat the introduction, you know, get them doing as soon as you can. And I know that I can hear through the electronic, all of these people saying, yeah, but I put down in the word cloud numbers, and what about technical problems? And what about embarrassment? And what about instruction language? And these are all hugely important considerations. And I'm not going to give any concrete answers, but we will, I'm not losing sight of them. I'm just giving an example here. Okay, so present, produce, and then once the students have produced very, very comprehensively, when you feel it's okay to set them free, get them to practice, okay? They introduce themselves and they modify what you've presented. Hi, my name's Nigel, I live in Berlin. You know, hi, my name's Sahela, I live in Hamburg, or whatever. You see what I mean. So, okay, that's what you're going to do. That's the curricular aspect. But if you're thinking about motivation and about what Donier said was important, how do you then incorporate that? Okay, so this is the how. The curriculum is really what you teach. If you're going to make a curriculum into a pedagogy, you also need to consider how you teach. And how I would say you would teach this thinking about motivation is as follows. You do it quickly, okay? Because I don't think I'm the only person who finds learning how to write Chinese challenging, okay? I've seen how it's taught in primary schools, and it's not very different to the way I did it. So, I mean, language learning of all things is challenging, it's difficult. So give students success relatively quickly. Give them something that's can be measured. So by the end of a class session, then they can do it. They can introduce themselves. And by doing that, their ideal self is, if they haven't really thought about it very much, maybe it comes into being. If they have thought about it, then it's there. This is the me. I want to be able to speak English like my teacher. Okay, I'm not there yet, but I can already introduce myself. So the first thing, do it quickly. That means you have to narrow your focus. Secondly, make your teaching student focused so that students, it's the opposite of what I'm doing now, but I'm going to shut up in 2 or 3 minutes and we'll become participant focused for a while. Get your students to speak as much as possible, even if much of the speaking is repetition, and don't burden your students with unnecessary detail about the target language. Okay, if you do that, you run the risk of damaging the student's ideal self. Your students may think, oh, I'm never going to be able to do that. This just happened, you know. Again, this is a personal anecdote. It's my partner who came here with me and who's just beginning to learn German, as you know, one has to, and there's a course called the integration course that he's going to. And the teacher who taught it in the first lesson started to talk to the students, who, remember, are zero knowledge German students. They're absolute beginners. The teacher started to talk to them about a number of quite complex aspects of the German language, which are not even necessary for level A1. And it predictably had a negative effect that I won't go into any further details of. Don't do that. It will demotivate your students. You know, I mean, it's like, you know, people learn well when they can do well. So encourage an atmosphere where there's a certain amount of speed. The teaching and learning is student focused, so the students can see that they're making progress. Don't forget, however, and I know now I've told you about my failure to write Chinese, you'll think that this is cheeky of me, but don't forget the ought to self. But I think the ought to self can be put into teaching in a non-threatening way. And so I might, in this class where I'm teaching how you introduce yourself in English, I might say, well, you know, what you also need to be able to do is to ask these questions of other people. And you don't have the language to do that yet, but you're going to get it. So that's what is next, because, you know, language is not just one way. It's not just productive, it's also receptive, as well as all of the other things it is. So that's a concrete example there of what I think a Donier influenced curriculum might look like. And I hope that that's given enough input for you to think about motivation, and think about motivation in particular in the context of online teaching and learning. All of the things I've suggested there, I think you can do in an online environment. There are still questions that you will have about that I can answer, but now is time for one of our time for reflection slots. And maybe here are two questions you can think about, but as I've said, if you'd like to ask other questions now, then that's also fine, because this is one of the gaps I said we'd have. What's your experience of student motivation in practice? How does it fit with anything I've said so far? And do you have any questions about actually anything we've looked at so far? Fadi has very kindly offered to moderate these time for reflection slots, which we've got, I think, 3 planned in the course of this afternoon's workshop. So I'm going to hand the floor to Fadi to moderate at this stage. We will need to look at the time, because I'm looking at it now and I've realized we're already pretty nearly halfway through the workshop. But I do want to have a pause to give you a chance to say some things. So I'm going to ask Fadi if you'd come and moderate the questions, the first set of questions for now.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. So as I mentioned at the beginning, you can ask either by writing down the question in the Q&A, or we would be very happy to hear your voice if you just click on the raise my hand button on your screen, and then you can ask us a question. Lynn has already left us a question in the Q&A. I think you were, Nigel, talking about the constraints, and she was asking about, would you please explain what you mean by constraints? And I don't know whether now you recall where this was.
Yes, but when I was talking about what is language, well, language is, what I meant by that is languages have systems of rules. And, you know, that's one of the things that characterizes a language. The example I gave being the one of pronunciation, where some languages have tighter constraints than others. And obviously, when you're teaching a language, that's one of the things you have to teach. And it's a very, very complex concept. And if we're going to teach language, whichever language it is that we're teaching, then that's one of the things that at some stage is going to feature in our language education curriculum.
All right. There is another question by Lubana. I will just read the question. Between theory and practice, there are a lot of challenges. Maybe the most difficult of them is developing pedagogy. That is a gap of generations, besides the gap in the skills to do self-motivation. So what is the daily routine and the advice in the MENA societies to pass these challenges?
That's an excellent question. I'm not able to give a concrete answer to everything there. And I also don't want to sound too much like a politician. Right, the challenges are there that you've identified, and they're all real. One of the reasons that we were able to move our teaching online so effectively at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology is that we didn't do it as individuals. We did it as a group. There are, as you say so presciently, there are lots of things between theory and practice. You can't just join them together like that. It doesn't happen. this is something I'm going to talk about later. Moving language education online is something that's got to be done in a planned way, and in a way that considers at least everything we're thinking about this afternoon, and doesn't just consider it, but it combines the consideration into what you do. There are, so I mean, that sounds like a terribly glib answer to a lot of very, very thoughtful and real issues. But there are certain circumstances under which some things are just not going to work. And in an institution, if a move to online teaching and learning simply happens as a result of a series of orders, my perception is that it's unlikely to be successful. Because all of those concerns that appeared in the word cloud, they're real concerns. They're not just, you know, they're all things I recognize from my experience as an online language teacher. And if, you know, institution A in country A is going to move into an online environment, all of those things have got to be considered. So this sounds like a cop-out, and I really don't mean it to, but it is. The institution has to want it to work, and it has to understand that what goes for students in terms of motivation also goes for educators. Cultural differences are important, and you can't ignore them. I have not taught in you know, MENA societies, so I'm not qualified to talk about that. But I'm aware of differences, for example, in an East Asian society, where, for example, there would not have been as much activity in the chat. There wouldn't have been as many questions, in my experience. People still ask questions, but they do it in a different way. What I would have done if I'd been giving this seminar in Hong Kong is I wouldn't have had the question and answer slots that we've put in the scheme that we've got this afternoon. I would have tried to go against my nature, talk much less, shorten it, and then I would have left a period for accidental chat at the end in the chat section, which I know has got problems. As Fadi says, it's very easy to miss important things in the chat, but that is a way in which people will be more likely to ask you questions, because in many East Asian societies, asking a question is an act which implies a failure to understand.
All right.
So that, I hope, that was a very long question to answer, but it was a very important question.
Yeah, it's very interesting to know about the other societies. I have actually one answer to your first question about the experience. I mean, what is your experience of students' motivation in practice? So we have Manan and Tasneem who have the following answer. For lower level, what I say is type at once so they can read and listen. I also use pictures and video clips. I always give them a chance to participate. I give them control to share the screen. Sometimes they are given the chance to work in pairs. So this is an answer. And there is another question by, I think, Lida or one of her colleagues. When motivation changes or decreases in intensity and focus, what do we have to do specifically with those who do not believe that they need it all in all?
Right. Again, there are extreme cases of that, and it depends on the intensity with which the motivation decreases. And again, I'm going to refer to this a bit later, but I have taught foreign languages in the most notoriously monolingual country on the planet, which is England in the United Kingdom. And what I can tell you from that extraordinarily unhappy experience is that, you know, there are educational circumstances where motivation isn't just decreasing, it's not there. And actually, when that happens in a modern society, I don't think at that level of absence of motivation, I don't think there's anything you can do. I mean, you know, you can't lock the students in a room without food and drink and say you can come out when you say you're going to be motivated. I mean, motivation is to a very is really is intrinsic. Okay, it comes from you inside. Of course, with English, in many societies, there are things that you can use to perhaps at least make a flickering of the ideal L2 self and say, well, wouldn't it be nice if you could do this or watch this, or, you know, watch Premier League football, or with, you know, with an English, or whatever. But the reason I think that Donier's process model is helpful is that it starts with the student deciding they want to do it. Now, I know this is really easy for me to say because I'm not teaching in a formal compulsory education scenario like a state secondary school, but I have done it, so I know what it's like. I don't honestly know how you get over a lack of motivation there. You just try to keep motivating the students and hope that in the end, like water on a stone, you'll make a channel.
All right, if I may also add something here to the keeping the motivation is from my experience. When my experience actually is not teaching languages, but teaching online in general. And this is also a challenge for me and my team at Niuversity. And what we try to use is the integration of technology. And by technology, I mean the softwares or applications or activities that students can do during the classroom or during the online class that changes the atmosphere a little bit or motivate them or make them compete. From my experience, when we make students compete, and I mean, also here depends on the ages. I mean, when we're talking about young learners or a little bit older learners, it's different. But usually I'm talking about till, let's say, 30 years, when we use gamification or using the competition thing, using other softwares, integrated softwares within the classroom, things are working so well. Just to keep the time, there is I will take this last question by Rashid, who I'm very happy to see with us today. And then I think we should move to the next step and we keep the other questions till the end. So Rashid has a very interesting question. What can be your advice for teachers to maintain their motivation during online teaching, bearing in mind that motivating students can represent a challenge per se?
That's a really valuable contribution. Thank you, Rashid. One of the things I noticed when we did this headlong dive into online teaching was that the people who didn't get thought about were us, the teachers. And it was an extremely stressful experience for many colleagues. Firstly, because, as I said earlier, rather tritely, you know, people who might have been slow adopters were suddenly forced to be very early adopters of online teaching and learning. And secondly, because of the particular circumstances of the pandemic, people were often sitting in a room like this on their own for long periods of time. As I'm said in answer to the earlier very prescient question from the colleague talking about how you adapt ideas about motivation and theory and practice, a proper institution will, and I mean proper in the sense of well-functioning and well-run institution, will not just think about the students. They'll think about the teachers as well. And as part of professional development, there will be support for teachers. I mean, we in the word cloud, you know, the issue was coming up about that maybe technical support is needed and so on. And I think that's also a very important consideration, but it's not the only kind. I mean, you know, what one had the experience of having colleagues breaking down in tears you know, when I was in Hong Kong, because of the extraordinarily high level of stress they felt, and because of course the students were going through this as well. I mean, it really was not the ideal way to do any of this, but again, I think if you move as an institution into online language teaching, you won't just think about the students, you will also think about your teachers and support them as they consider questions of motivation, including their own motivation, if they're teaching in a very difficult situation.
All right, I will, before we move, since I have a raised hand, so I will encourage this and take the question.
Sure.
To encourage more hearing the voice. So I think this is Lida or one of her colleagues. So you have now the microphone, just click on the unmute and go ahead.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Lida, and on behalf of the whole group, we say hello.
Hello.
I've got this question. I wrote it actually in the QA slot, and I said, well, you mentioned earlier that asking a question is a failure of understanding. However, I asked the question, which is, what do you do when there is no motivation from the very beginning, all in all, where students are not convinced that they need this language in the first place? And what we all agree on here in this classroom is that we all agree that, well, there's nothing to do, except for, as Manal said, extrinsic motivation. And she mentioned something here, which is, well, financial, some kind of financial incentives to the students so that they can have this kind of motivation. Anyways, I'm just saying here is that we do struggle actually with the motivation of some students where they fail to like online courses, not to mention face-to-face courses, because they don't know they're not aware of the importance of the language that they are learning and why they need it, or if they need it at all. And thank you very much. Yeah, specifically online, yeah, of course.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, if there is an absolute absence of motivation, I mean, you know, total absence of motivation, and sometimes also you get things in the other direction. You will get antipathy, where people aren't, it's not just they're not motivated, they actively don't want to do something. Then, you know, we're educators, we're not miracle workers. Okay, we're not psychotherapists. You know, if schools need psychotherapists, they should go and hire one. Okay, because that's not my qualification, you know. They're really, you know, we cannot work miracles. In some parts of the world, I mean, it's sorry, Lida, I don't know where you're speaking from, but I mean,
it's Syria.
Okay, here anyway, in many learning environments, and again, particularly thinking about English, that the motivation is societally and economically there, because everybody here knows that if you want a certain level of employment in Germany, you have to have English. It's not an option, okay? And it, you know, that range of employment is not just saying to students, okay, if you want to be a medical doctor, you have to have English. I mean, it goes, it's a very, very wide continuum of employment. So in some societies, there are those motivational forces which are there for you. In other societies, they're not there to the same degree. And again, I mean, institutions that ask us as educators to create them are missing a trick. We can't, you know. I mean, if you are teaching, as I was trying to teach, you know, other European languages in a resolutely monolingual society like Eastern England, where there's not just lack of motivation, there's antipathy, because it's also quite a xenophobic place. You know, be like Lazi in the Chinese classic and leave quietly by a side door, because you're not going to produce any linguists under those circumstances. What you can do, and what I and my colleagues tried to do there, was at least diminish the antipathy. And in that, I think we were successful, but that wasn't online, so it's not pertinent to today's meeting. And again, that's not a very direct answer to your question, but it's an acknowledgement, I hope, that you make an important point.
Many thanks. I'd like to add something here, which is again, all this depends on the age of the students as well, and the type of students or the age of students that I was talking about was just like in their teens. You see,
yes.
So antipathy is just so expected on their part, even though English is very important everywhere in the world and in our context as well. But they're still not aware of that, and even if you try hard to just make them aware of the importance of the language, they still resist that. So yeah, it is antipathy that we are fighting here. Older students, let's say, or adult students are easier to deal with in online situations, to be honest.
Thank you very much, Lida, and please say hello to your colleagues over there. I think we have to go back to the presentation, and Noor has already asked a question. I will leave this till the end. So please, okay, Nigel, go ahead.
Okay, I will. Right. I'll also try to speed up because I am aware of the timing. And you know, if you've got a question about motivation, it doesn't mean you can't ask it. You know, there'll be more time for questions, but I'll try and move on now, having thought a bit about motivation, which, remember, we were talking about in the context of how do we get the students involved? How do we actually get students to be with us? Now I want to think, probably in the end it's going to be quite quickly, about how do we get students to interact in a way that is useful, because as language teachers, as language learners, we know that that's part of the learning process. And again, here I'm only just going to look at one very, very small focus, which is instructional approaches. So an instructional approach, perhaps, you know, you can also think of other phrases that describe the same thing, but when I talk about an instructional approach, I mean an approach which is an overall guide to general principles that are applied to a curriculum. And what an instructional approach tries to do is define broadly how teachers teach and students learn. And of course, they're points that any serious educator should think about. Now, again, we're condensed this evening because time and everything, and we're already running over. But I do want at least to present 3 instructional approaches out of many, out of certainly a couple of dozen that you can find in the literature quite easily. But I've chosen these because I think you may have heard of them. Content, and in brackets after the name of the instructional approach, are the scholars who I think are probably most readily identified with them. The first one is content-based, which is basically that students learn a language through content. So they learn science in the target language and end up by learning, where the target language is, for example, English, and they end up by learning both science and, in our example, English. This is contents-based language instruction, sometimes known by the acronym CILL, C-I-L-L, for content integrated language learning, is quite a big focus here in the German-speaking part of Europe. But it's also widespread outside of Europe. So that's one instructional approach. Basically, that you don't teach language separately, you teach other things and you use the language, the target language, to do it. Now, as language educators, I can almost hear coming through the airwaves your gasps of saying, well, crikey, that will never work, or whatever. But anyway, bear with me, please. Okay, so that's one instructional approach I'm thinking of. Another one, very, very widely known, and something that I have worked with personally very closely, is the task-based approach, which is where you ask students to perform tasks in the target language, English in our case. An example at quite a high level of proficiency would be students have to write an email to provide information in a professional context. That's their task. okay? And the task, according to Ellis's and other scholars' conception, has, as well as the task itself, a pre-task and a post-task. The pre-task is where you prepare the students with the information and the knowledge and the language that they need to do the task. The task is when they do it, and the post-task is when they think about what they've done. So the actual language learning happens in all of those three stages. There are different views about where most of it happens and how it happens, but this is just another instructional approach, task-based. So we've got Lister et al. Saying, don't teach language, just teach a subject using the target language to do it, and all will be well. You've got Rod Ellis and others saying, give the students something meaningful to do in the target language and suddenly everything will fall into place. And because you're giving them something meaningful to do, they will learn the language they need to do it. And then the last of the three that I'm considering, I have to emphasize that this isn't an exhaustive list. They're just things, ideas, as the postmodernists say, to think with, is the idea of processing instruction. And Bill van Patten is probably the scholar who's most closely associated with this, has certainly written very, very many papers to expound his ideas. It's grounded in cognitive psychology, and it's thus quite complex, but basically, this instructional approach involves presenting students with material that illustrates a grammatical point, and the students are encouraged to link the grammatical point to the language as presented themselves. So you present the students with the grammatical point here and the language there, and you devise a curriculum which encourages them to make the link. So three of the instructional approaches that you may have heard of. Before I go on to, that's of course quite theoretical. Before I go on to be more practical, there are some points to consider. Not any of the three people mentioned on the previous slide, I'm sure, would consider or actually say that any single instructional approach can provide everything all students and teachers need. And certainly in connection with the three that I've just mentioned, there are these things to bear in mind. Rod Lister is from Canada, and a lot of the literature and a lot of the research on the effectiveness, which after all is what most literature in our field is, about the appropriateness of content-based instruction comes out of work in bilingual societies with high levels of formal migration. Canada, being a case in point, it's already bilingual, particularly since the language reforms of the 1980s, which made the whole country French, English bilingual. It has a high level of formal immigration where large numbers of people need to learn the language that is in widespread use, or the languages in the case of Canada, in widespread use in the country to which people migrate. The other country where a lot of work has been done on content-based work outside of Europe is Australia, which is also, although it's theoretically a monolingual country and constitutionally a monolingual country, it has very high levels of formal immigration. You have large numbers of people arriving who need to acquire English very, very quickly. Its popularity or its prominence in the German-speaking part of Europe, which is all I can talk about with any certainty, is based in a different set of circumstances, which is that the process, and it's done mostly with English, which I'll also talk about a bit more later, which is that many, many students enter secondary stage education in many parts of German-speaking Europe with already quite a good level of English. That's a very loose term, but I'll just park it there for now. The third instructional approach, and probably the one that's least widely adopted officially by educational institutions, input processing, has its roots in the formal academic fields of linguistics and psychology, whereas the task-based research one, which I missed out, sorry, in the middle, has got its roots in teacher education and educational research. So these three approaches that I mentioned, they're all different, they all have different origins, they've all got different levels of adoption. Task-based, I would say, is probably the most widely adopted, or certainly there's the literature about it is extensive. But there's a lot of literature if you're an applied linguist, an academic applied linguist, working in an applied linguistics department rather than teaching language. I think it's maybe less widely adopted. So those are just some points to consider. So what would this look like practically in terms of what we might do in a classroom? These are some very, very simple suggestions. If we try and look back to my example from Common European Framework A1 about where you tell people about yourself and you learn about others, I can't really see how this can be covered in using a content-based instructional approach, because it's something that happens socially and culturally outside of the educational domain. Perhaps it could appear in geography or environmental studies. I'm not sure. But again, I think I couldn't think of an example of how you would teach that part of Common European Framework A1 using a content-based instructional approach. Task-based, because task-based theory comes from people like us, from the teacher and teacher education part of the academy, it's easier to see. I think you can think about, you situate the learning of the CEFR content in a job interview, if you're thinking about spoken discourse, or in the simple task of filling out a form, if you're thinking about written discourse. Okay, and big tasks don't need to be long, they can be quite short. They can happen in one session, which would help with motivation. So filling out a simple ID card form for yourself in written discourse in the target language would be a task-based instructional approach. Much more difficult, again, with processing instruction, because the language you need to introduce yourself and understand in instructions in English isn't complex. And processing instruction is definitely grammar focused rather than lexically focused or phonologically focused. And, one has to remember, if you're old like me, you think that those are the three bits of a language. There's the grammar, the rules, there's the lexis, the meaning bits, the words, headphones, mouth, eyes, nose, and so on. And then there's the phonology, the fact that I say nose and not niche. And processing instruction definitely is very, very heavily grammar focused. So I think I found it hard to think. Perhaps you could focus on differences between statements, my name is, and question forms, what is your name? Now I'm thinking here about English. In other language, such as I believe with my very limited knowledge Arabic, where asking and answering information is grammatically more complex, processing instruction might have a place. But I think the thing to keep in mind here is that nobody, and no scholar even would I think say, well, I believe processing instruction is really effective. That's all you ever need to do. And I'm lucky enough to have met some workers in each of these fields, and certainly I think that the openness that I've mentioned there is something that they all share. So again, what I've tried to do there in that very, very brief and quite rapid, I'm sorry, I know I'm speaking very quickly, but my eye is on the time here, idea of some theory about instructional approaches, because what we want to know in our online environment is not just how to motivate students to bring them in, but it's how to make them or cause them, said he using, I'm sorry, I used a bit too ergative there, to interact with each other in a useful way. That's what this is about. And at that point, I'm going to stop and give my voice a rest and hand over to Fadi for the next question, which can include anything you've got left you want to ask about motivation. Please, I don't want to close down avenues of discussion. What value, if any, and I know there are some educators who would be very on the theory is theory, practice is practice side here, do you see in thinking about instructional approaches or any other questions you've got at this time? So I'll hand over to Fadi here to kindly moderate the next few minutes of our meeting.
Yes, I'm very happy to receive your questions. So I will start with the question that Noor has asked before. She said, can we as teachers create the motivation in our younger learners, or the situation with them is the same as the older ones? And if the answer is yes, how can we do that?
My experience of teaching younger learners is quite limited, only in Hong Kong, to students who, because of the particular linguistic environment in Hong Kong, already had quite a lot of English. So what I was able to do with those primary age students in Hong Kong, because of the language that they already had, was to do things with the language. So like, for example, I got hold of some footage of a bear, of the animal, a bear that broke into a convenience store somewhere in Canada. And I showed them the footage of the bear breaking into the convenience store and going into the refrigerator and taking things. And they had to write the story for somebody, and then I had them act it out. One of them got to be the bear and things like that. Now, not everybody will have primary age students who already have the proficiency level of language to do that. But the students who are primary age students may not have the proficiency to do what I've just described, but they all have the competence, because all children understand stories. And they tend to be quite a motivating thing for younger learners. So going back to what I said earlier about motivation being, make sure that the learners see a payoff quite quickly. There are simpler stories than the one about a bear breaking into a convenience store. There are other stories you can think of. And I think one of the things that again, I'm going back to Donier here, that where the ought to self can be useful is if you make it clear to your students. And please, I've taught in an East Asian society. I know this isn't easy. You have to persuade your students it's okay to make mistakes. I really do know that's not easy. But I mean, here is no problem. I mean, people make mistakes all the time. I mean, Germans make mistakes with German, and I see things written, and anyway, that's another story. But in some cultures, this can be a really difficult thing to do. But I think by trying to move the affective domain online, which takes some thinking about and will take some work, then and creating a supportive atmosphere for students, where you say, okay, we're going to do something, and at the end of this, you will be able to tell a story in English. Okay, and maybe you do it this way. You say, if you're encountering primary age students with limited linguistic resources, you make the task fit the resource, and you say, okay, you can only use 20 words. Tell me the story. Here's a picture. You could even have the bear raiding the fridge in the convenience store. Okay, tell me the story using 20 words. Put them in the right order. And they're, of course, 20 words that the students already know. I mean, we're all educators, you have to plan stuff. So I think you can do things that will motivate learners regardless of their level of proficiency. I think what is important always is you have to think about students' competences, and competences are plurilingual because they're not just related to a language. I mean, everybody can tell a story. I mean, even if it's like at a very, very simple level. You know, I got up this morning and as I was making coffee, I looked out of the window and I saw a fox. Okay, it's a story. It's a very, very basic human activity. Language is a very, very basic human construct. So I think you can do it, but it needs to be thought about. That's just a suggestion anyway. I'm aware that I'm talking too much and Fadi is too polite to shut me up. So more questions.
Well, it's really interesting for me to know that this issue of motivation is that important. I don't have questions in the Q&A. If you would like to ask via the microphone, please just hit the raise my hand button. Meanwhile, I will just maybe contribute to this question about the instructional approaches, or I don't know whether we can also use the instructional design here, because also, I mean, from my experience, the instructional design has become one of the main factors of a successful delivery of an online class. Because especially, you mentioned at the beginning of the workshop, what happened in your university when you had to do everything in a week. And what happened, I think this was copied in different, or maybe in the whole world. And the practice that was happening, that the teachers, or most of them, were having PowerPoint presentations or whatever kind of delivery materials, and they just switched their camera and microphone and started talking, doing the same thing. And that's why this created kind of a disappointment by the students and by the parents, for instance. Like, this is not engaging, the students or our sons and daughters are getting so bored. And I think this gave a rise to the instructional design, that you cannot just do online classes like this. And I used to call them, like, this is doing traditional teaching through technological devices, but it's still very traditional, and you did not compensate for the loss of the environment that was there. And the instructional design comes here as a kind of a remedy for this. Like, okay, when the way we instruct or we design our instructions during the class, we kind of like compensate for this environment, or we create an alternative environment. So I would say that, I mean, again, here I say that I'm very weak with language teaching online, so I don't know what applies there. But I encourage you to read a little bit about instructional design in the field of language teaching, because I think one of the keys to the maybe motivation and also engagement of the students lies in the way how you design the instructions of your class. I see no questions here, so I think we can move on.
Thanks very much, Fadi. Just to follow up on instructional design, I endorse everything Fadi said. I mean, because my university in Hong Kong was, as I said, already working in this field, we had some instructional designers on the staff. And I was lucky enough to be able to work with one when I created the very large, by our standards, online writing course. And it was an extremely valuable experience for me, because I met somebody in Maya, the instructional designer, who both knew about language education and the technological aspects of delivering it, as well as an overarching view, instructional design, of how you might teach language online. And here you can motivate your students, actually, because these people are like hen's teeth, as they say in British English. There aren't enough of them around. And the Maya, who helped me all those years ago, nearly 10 years ago, in Hong Kong, went to the States to work, and is now, I've lost lost track of her. She's now somewhere in Europe. These people are desperately sought, and I think it's a field of endeavor that's only going to increase. So getting students to see they could maybe do that would be one motivation. But it's really, really important, and I'm not giving enough time to that aspect of online language teaching in this quite short meeting that we're having this afternoon. But now, as Fadi says, I'm going to go back to the last thing I want to talk about, and so that there is some time for sort of a wrap up and some last questions. I'm going to go quite quickly again, but you will get the recording. So we started thinking about how do we bring the students in, how do we get them motivated, how do we engage them, then starting to think about really difficult issues. How do we get students to interact with each other and with us in a way that is effective? In other words, in a way that helps them learn what we're trying to teach, which is language. Now I want to look at how do we make sure that all of this in the end is effective, that when they come out, the students at the end of our Common European Framework A1 class, they really can do everything that's on that grid that the CEFR says that people who are A1 certified, they can do. How do we make sure? I think you do it by having a pedagogy. So not to detract from what we were just saying about instructional design, online teaching is different to face-to-face teaching, but it does have a lot in common with it. So it's best guided by a pedagogy, which means a clear idea of how teaching and learning happen, what's going to be learned, and why it's going to be learned. And as we've just seen or heard, in the context of an online environment, perhaps the subject specialist on our own, we're not enough for the time being, when not everybody has all of the skills. As when you're in a physical classroom, your online pedagogy has to be flexible because you're dealing with human beings, not blocks of wood. People change, motivation changes, engagement changes. So you need to have some flexibility. And what I think is that when you create a pedagogy, when you create your pedagogy for your course or however, wherever you create it, what you're actually doing is putting theory to work. The last point, as an introductory point I'd make here, is that when it comes to pedagogy, students as well as teachers need to know about the pedagogy in use. They won't guess it. So you need to teach a course to students as well as its content. This is, if you like, very, very basic level of instructional design. So students need to know what's happening and why and when. And in particular, students and teachers clearly need to understand what the intended outcomes are of the course. Now, I know we live in an age that's cursed by outcomes, and it's an overused word. Many of us would probably be very happy if we never heard it again, but it's a convenient word and it describes what is important, which is your students who come to you, assuming they're motivated and everything else is okay, they want to leave your institution's course with a certain level of proficiency in a particular language. So, online students, students are students, but if you want to think about the online bit of students, I think that can also be useful as well. But we all know, I think, that in many, many contexts of online teaching and learning, dropout rates are normally very high. I mean, one of the things Fadi has already shared with me is that at Niuversity, they're not, so they don't have to be high. And of course, when you're doing online teaching and learning in a university context, where students are working towards certification or qualification or whatever, you know, that does a lot of keeping students with you for you. But motivation is definitely important. We all know that not all students learn in the same way. And I think that, we ought to look at the possibilities of online language teaching as a way of tailoring teaching and learning. In other words, a way of making it more individual. I'm talking about an ideal world here. I know it's not always easy, but I do think it's possible. Managing online teaching and facilitating online language learning are also going to be different to their face-to-face equivalents. So while there will be things that are the same about the act of teaching and learning, the overarching activities of managing and facilitating, they're going to be different. They have to be, which is why new disciplines like that of industrial design and others that I don't probably know about are coming into being, because you need people who can do this. And so I think probably pulling everything together, it helps if we think of the whole process as totally different, even if we know that it contains professional knowledge and professional practice that's not new. We need to put professional knowledge and practice together with learning that will happen as we work on the job, and create a pedagogy as we work, rather than taking one off the shelf. So I think that for an online student, needs analysis is more important than ever in an online course of instruction. And I'm thinking back now to the concerns that many of you put in the word cloud about why students learn, whether they want to, what they might find difficult, possibilities for things going wrong, the need for support, the issue of language of instruction and target language, basic issues like embarrassment and lots of things that we could just lump under the affective domain. Not all students have the same needs. Even within the process of learning a language, students will have different needs, and we can bear that in mind. Some students may have a longer term view with the language. Some of them may have a much shorter term view. Like on the Integrationskurs here in Germany, most of the students, most of my partner's classmates, they just want the basics so they can go out and get a job that isn't working in the Amazon warehouse. Okay, where you don't need German to do that. It's an English environment and it only pays the basic wage, the minimum legal wage. If you want more, you need to be able to have some German, and that's what they want. They don't want to be able to read, the Times of India or the Sydney Morning Herald in English. They don't care about that. They just want enough to go out there and get another job. Other people might have longer term views. They may want to study later in the target language or whatever. So we need to bear that in mind. Not all students have the same approach to their learning. Some of them are very lazy, like me. Others have other factors that affect how they can learn. They may be working, they may be raising a family, all kinds of things. Some students prefer the quick, intensive way, like a lot of the people on the Integrationskurs here, just, hurl it at us, we'll do 12 hours a week. How the effectiveness is not a priority. They just want to get to the end of the course and go out and get a job. And lastly, referring back to the work of a friend of mine, Peter Skian, who's a notable applied linguist and psychologist, individuals have individual differences. And effective teaching online or face-to-face is about working with individuals. So that's all a little bit theoretical. Let's try and wrap up by looking at something very practical. Here's an example of how you might teach online the language you need to find a job. This is the kind of thing that would come in the target language of German towards the end of the Integrationskurs which is meant to set people up to go into the workplace. So the task, which is a bit of a task-based pedagogy here, have agreed to find a job for their classmate. It may not be a totally believable case, but anyway, that's what I'm using for now. They're given information about their classmate, what their classmates' interests are, what kind of job they want, what times they can work, what their qualifications are. You then have an online resource that you create or you can buy of a database of job advertisements in language that they can access for now. So A1, A2 language level. So I'm going to be blunt, you dumb down the language so that the students can access it. And they use that database to choose one job that their classmates might like. You could use real job advertisements, but simplify the language. You can also then use additional reading material as an introduction to the task. And again, you might need to edit that so that it's accessible. It's what happens in course books all the time. The old-fashioned paper course books that many of us used when we were in school. The language in it bore no relationship to the language actually used in the real world. But the language in the books helped you to learn. The problem for my generation was nobody told us that. And when I left home at the age of 18, thinking I could speak French and went to work in a French hotel kitchen, I learned very quickly that I might have got a particular school leaving exam in French, but I did not have any of the French that you needed to work in a hotel kitchen. I learned very quickly, by the way. So, but I'm not saying that you shouldn't dumb things down, you shouldn't simplify things, but I think what you can do and what would avoid my period of torture in the hotel kitchen would be at the same time as you use the simplified language to help students find a job for their classmate, then you give them access and exposure to the real thing. And I don't think there's a problem with that. And students may not be massively proficient in the language you're trying to teach them, but they're not stupid. They know that they're learning. So you can refer to the ought to self, if you go back to Donnier's motivation, and say, okay, here's some real job advertisements from the Berliner Tageszeitung or the local newspaper in English. This is what they really look like. One day you're going to have to be able to do that. For now, we're doing the basics and we'll move on. Again, with this example, understanding the language you need to find a job. Thinking about motivation, give your students frequent feedback, because it helps with students' awareness of an L2 self. Now, there is an absolutely massive literature on feedback. We can't even go into it. I'll just mention it's there. If online in particular, and this is where technology and people with an understanding of that and instructional design come in, you need to try and make feedback at least partly personal and conversational, as in interactive, because that will further form students' L2 selves. One of the problems, I mean, it appeared in your word cloud, is what about students who just get left behind? I mean, we've all been in a physical classroom and we know the students who sit at the back and who aren't really with us. And okay, we need to find a way of walking over to the student, putting your hand on the desk and saying something pleasant and personal to that student to encourage them in an electronic environment. Some of the things about good teaching don't change because we're doing it electronically rather than physically. One of the things you could also do to help motivation are add-on activities suggesting to students what more they could do. So, what do you need to know how to apply, not just to find a job. So you've looked at some job adverts and you've found a job that you think your classmate would like. What language do you need to be able to do more than that to be actually to fill out an application form or to write an email applying? Just think about it because that's what you're going to need to learn next, and you're going to need to learn the language that enables you to do that. So, and that was very, very garbled and quite quick, I'm aware, and I'm wanting to be quick in order that there is time for some questions at the end. So just to try and pull things together, what we're teaching is language, and it's complex. You know, it's formal, it's functional, it's big, and it's complicated. And that's always going to be true. It's true in the classroom, it's true when we teach online. Now, as somebody who for the last nearly decade of my working life was a university administrator as well as a university teacher, I know that one of the forces that comes with online teaching and learning is to widen the number of people involved. In other words, to have bigger classes. That's not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. But what I think is that expansion will not and cannot easily be the same in all areas. So, for example, I mean, Fadi said that one of the things that happened, and certainly this was true in Hong Kong as well, at the start of the pandemic, was some of the late adopter people simply videoed their lectures, or in my case of my institution, they already had videos of their lectures and they just put those on their line. Now, I mean, the lecture as an academic construct has got its value. And I'm not saying that we should get rid of it. But I think the need to have large rooms in which 400 or 500 people can physically sit in the same space as the lecturer, I think that is now a redundant, largely redundant concept. And so the lecture parts of certain courses of learning can be very effectively delivered online, enhanced even, I would say, if your institution has enough instructional designers to do that. And that can be something that can happen with quite large numbers of groups. I'm saying here, you know, things that are presentational can be done in very large numbers of groups. And with the first course I did, which was a blended learning course, not completely online, I engineered a trade-off where the presentational parts of the writing course were moved online. So they were effectively taught to a class of 1,200 students. And I used the resources I saved because I was told when I did this course, you can't have any more money. You can't have any more staff. But I used the resources I saved by putting all of the presentational stuff online to give students very, very small classes, 10 students to one instructor, for interactive work on the writing skills they needed to write a traditional 5-paragraph academic essay in English, which is what the course was about. So those, you know, in that one course, in this case, it was in a blended learning environment, we had very large fora and very small fora in which students were working. And I think you can do that in language education. Perhaps the balance will be more towards smaller groups. I mean, it's something that we have to see as the field evolves, because there's also a place for automated instruction in language education. So I think, you know, some things can be done in big groups, but I do think that some aspects of language education will always need to be done in smaller groups. Maybe they need to be done in smaller groups working with artificial intelligence rather than a physical person like us. But I think that small group size is probably always going to be important for some parts of language education. In order to let that happen, flexibility has to be across the board. It can't just be us, the teachers, who have to be flexible, or the students who have to be flexible. The institutions in which we work, and I'm aware that that's the third time I've referred to this, they need to be flexible as well. And so a student-focused pedagogy is indispensable, I think, is the last thing I'd like to say in my concluding remarks. So we're teaching something that's complex. The way in which we're teaching it, if we teach it online, is also, I think, inevitably complex. So finally, to sum up, online language education definitely presents teachers and learners with challenges, and I don't pretend for a minute that I've seen them all or I'm aware of them all. So what I've done today is I've presented some theory-based suggestions, and they are only suggestions. And like all suggestions, they're for you to take and modify or not, or replace or abandon, or whatever you want to do with them. But they're suggestions that I think would ensure student engagement. So students are with you, they're motivated, or at least they're more likely to be motivated. That they interact, that you set up learning activities which cause students to do things. The antithesis of what I'm doing with you right now. And what both of those things feed into and end in is an appropriate pedagogy in online language education. Now, I have to be honest and say that for about the last few months, about the last 12 months, due to resettlement and all the things that happen when you move country and move home, I'm less completely in touch with recent developments than I would like to be, or than I have been. So I'm not, I'm sure that a lot has been going on that I'm unaware of. But my basic strategy, that you need the engagement, the interaction, and those come together in an appropriate online pedagogy, that is almost, I think, an article of faith for me. From what I have been able to see over the past 12 months, still being in touch, with various colleagues and friends in the field, is that, online education was actually growing quite expansively before the pandemic. So, one had all kinds of initiatives. The first completely online master's degrees already existed before the pandemic. All kinds of initiatives were going on there. After the pandemic, largely because of things that happened force majeure, people had to do things. I think it's probably here to stay. I think, there are all kinds of feedback loops that are going to happen, whether people like it or not. I mean, our neighbor and friend here in Berlin teaches the 3rd class. So she's teaching 9-year-old students in a primary school. And the students who are in this class that she's teaching this year, because of the pandemic, have been learning remotely or learning under altered circumstances for almost their entire school career. Students start primary school at 6 in Germany. And my friend says that this is the most difficult class she has ever taught. There are children in it who cannot, and they're German children. They lived here, they're long-term German residents, and they speak German at home, and they can't read and write properly. Now, if you know Germany and somebody tells you that I've got students in the 3rd class who are having real trouble with very, very basic German, then that's a bit of a shock. I read another report online in the newspaper here this morning that in the neighboring state of Brandenburg, they've done an audit of 4th class students who seem to have a much higher level of difficulty with German than normal. So I think, yes, we've seen all kinds of possibilities, and I'm a great believer in those possibilities. But I mean, there has been some stuff that's happened that hasn't been ideal as well. And it's happened over a very, very large part of our world, that young people's education has been disrupted. So we need to bear that side of things. And, we need to learn from it, I think, as well. But I think online education is with us to stay. I'm sure that we're aware that there are pluses and minuses. And on that note, so that there is at least some time for any further questions, and I know Fadi wants to talk to you a bit, I'll say thank you for your kind attention, your perspective and your perceptive questions. Thanks very much again for asking me. There's a general Q&A now that can be, as far as I'm concerned, about absolutely anything, which Fadi has again kindly offered to moderate.
Thank you very much, Nigel, for this presentation. It was really a lot of information, and it's good that all of us will have the recording to go back to certain points. I mean, I wrote down a lot of notes to go back to and research deeply. There was a question before from Lama. She says, ignorance about the different tools, options, and resources online teaching can offer. Ignorance about different tools, options, and courses online teaching can offer is one of the main reasons for the lack of motivation on the part of students as well as teachers. I think it is only a matter of time until we can appreciate the online educational experience. So it was not a question, rather a kind of a remark.
And one I agree with entirely, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Noura. If you have still questions, use the microphone, the raise my hand button. We would be very happy to hear your voice and listen to your question. All right, meanwhile, if somebody is encouraged to ask questions, I will just repeat that you will receive an email from us with the recording of this workshop, and with also a link that will ask you to write your name and email address and a consent to use your information so we can mint your NFT, the non-fungible token, for your attendance of this workshop. And here I have Nayuda. Yeah, please, Nayuda, go ahead.
Yes, hello. Good afternoon. Good evening. Hi. Thank you very much, Nigel, for the very interesting and informative lecture. And thanks, Fadi, for organizing. I have actually two simple questions that I just want to make sure to get your point of view or opinion as an expert in actually teaching languages and your research in that. The first one is, like, what do you think of those who know the language and are very happy to transfer their knowledge about it? In other words, teaching it to others online, let's say, but they do not have actually the certificate, or let's say the teaching qualification to do that. In general, is that a big problem or not? And the second question is, what do you suggest when actually teaching, let's say, Arabic, for example, to non-speakers, of course? Is it okay to use another language to help them in getting Arabic? Because, for example, it depends from one language to another, probably. I agree, for example, that when teaching English, you have to do everything in English. Is that the same for all languages, you think? And thank you very much.
Thank you much, Noda, for two really good questions. I'm going to answer them the other way around, if you don't mind. I'm going to answer your second question first,
okay,
which is a question about language of instruction and target language. Now, I think that the target language is what we want our students to acquire. It's what our students want to acquire. There will be circumstances where it is much, much easier if the language of instruction is the language that is the student's L1, the language the students have as their own language. Now, obviously, there are circumstances where that's difficult. For example, in the Integrationscourse here in Berlin, people are learning German, but you will have people whose first language is Arabic, people whose first language is Farsi. You can have maybe 8 or 9 first languages in one room. In a situation where all the students have the same first language, my view is use it as a teaching and learning tool. I had teachers that I worked with in Hong Kong who strongly disapproved of the fact that I allowed my students to speak their own language in my classroom. But we already, we had small classes with 20, 25 absolute maximum, but and it helped that I'm illiterate, but I can speak. So I knew what they were saying. So I knew that they were talking about the class, not about the football. And if that helps students learn, you do it in any language that they share. And that, I think, also that fosters all kinds of motivation, because there's nothing more demotivating than working really hard at something and not making progress. And if a situation in a classroom exists where you can use your safety net of your L1, be it Arabic, be it Farsi, be it French, be whatever it is, to gain a quicker understanding, then I think that's a positive. In a circumstance where you've got lots of L1s in the same classroom, of course, then you get back to what was called, in my day, the direct method of teaching, where you only use the target language as the language of instruction. But there's an inherent problem in doing that. I'm not saying it can't be done, by the way. The problem that's inherent in that is that in order to explain and rationalize language in the language that you're learning, the meta language, if you like, using language to talk about language, you need a linguistic level of competence which is higher than the one you're trying to acquire. Okay, so if I'm trying to say in English, yesterday played tennis because it was sunny. And I need to explain to you that the verb play changes to played when we describe certain instances of that action in the past. You've already heard what's happening to my language. We played tennis yesterday is a very different set of linguistic constructs from you need the kind of language which enables you to explain that play becomes played when we use it to describe certain instances of that action in the past. So that there are problems with the direct method. It can be done, but it needs to have special instructional design, whether it's instructional design in a book or in an online environment. And my experience is it takes longer. There are scholars who've written and said, yes, it takes longer, but it works better. People retain it longer. I mean, it's interesting that I mean, again, on a personal level, the very few smatterings of Arabic that I retain because when I first trained as a teacher, we were all taught a language we didn't know, and and this was back in the days of direct method, and I was taught for 4 weeks an introductory course in Arabic by the direct method, and 50 years later I can still, nearly 50 years later, I can still remember quite a lot of it. But so I think that basically the whole issue of the classroom ecology, what languages are there, is something that needs to be thought about. But I do not have this absolutely rigid view that the only language can be the language of instruction. I think it's very possible for there to be other languages in the classroom and for the whole experience of the classroom to be rich and focused on acquiring more of the target language. In answer to your other very good question about people who have the language ability and the language competence who just want to share it, a priori, of course, there's nothing wrong with that, and it's to be welcomed. But for example, I'm thinking about somebody who's willing to spend time just conversing in the target language with learners. That's, of course, it's valuable and it's to be welcomed. But particularly, you know, all of this is being very, very sharply brought into focus for me at the moment with the vision I'm getting through my partner's eyes of language education in a Volkshochschule in Germany. Just because you can speak a language, it doesn't mean you're going to be a good language educator of that language. That doesn't mean to say you can't contribute, talk, share, benefit, but there are things that you need to know if you are going to design and deliver a course of study in a second language to people. And I'm not sure that everybody who happens to be linguistically capable has got that knowledge. Sorry, that was a very long and complicated answer, but I hope it's at least engaged with what you were kind enough to offer.
Thank you very much. And Nigel and I are very happy to announce that we will be offering a comprehensive course on teaching languages online, talking about, I mean, it will be in details, of course, where I will share my experience about integrating technology and using the best tools with gamification and instructional design and also behavioral economics inside the any course. And he will be sharing also from the linguistic point of view what can be done in the classroom. And in the link that you will receive with the email, also you can write down if you're interested in attending this course. Nigel, thank you very much for today. This was very informative and very intensive. And thank everyone who stayed with us till now, and also for those who left for different reasons. Thank you very much for attending. Hopefully this was a useful workshop for you and time well spent. We wish you all the best. And Nigel, do you want to say any word at the end?
Just to add my thanks to everyone, and to you again, Fadi, for asking me to contribute, and to wish everybody well and good health.
All right, thank you very much. All the best to you. Have a good night and see you soon.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.